You are listening to an American Free Press podcast.
Joining me on the line is Ed Whitney, the author of a new book called The Controllers, Secret Rulers of the World. Ed, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks. I'm very glad to be with you.
Ed, I want to get into this book in great detail in a moment. But before we do, for the benefit of the listeners, could you give them a little bit of background about who you are?
Sure. Well, I'm a person that has been interested in economic issues and political issues for some time. I have a bachelor's degree in economics with a minor in political science, and then I went on to get a master's degree in finance. I spent most of my working career in the insurance and risk management business and acquired some professional designations in that field as well. But when I started getting into this New World Order stuff that President George H.W. Bush started mentioning back about 1990, I found that I was missing a great deal of information, things that the insiders were kind of keeping away from us. I call it a case of AIDS, that's acute information deficit, a very common but curable disease. So I started really getting into it big time, reading a lot of books and a lot of DVDs and stuff like that to try to catch up for what I've been missing all the years.
Mm-hmm. And where are you from, Ed? Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, raised there, and spent most of my life there except for a few years in San Diego. But now I'm back again living in Connecticut where my family lives, so that works out very well.
I guess then or at least your experience with watching Connecticut transform from what it was when you were a child to what it is now, I guess that somehow played into your larger view of what's happening.
Yeah. Well, I happen to live in Westport, which is a very affluent town, but only 10 miles away is the city of Bridgeport, which has really fallen into hard times. At one point in the middle of the World War II, it was a very prominent industrial area, and a lot of that industry has moved out. A large part of the problem is because there's been a lot of what I call socialistic influence, and basically the government managed to drive out the business, and somehow you've got a lot of poor folks living in the town. Even though it's the largest city in Connecticut, it's kind of a sad story to look at.
Mm-hmm. Is it mostly minorities that are destroying it?
Yes, there's still a majority of people are white American people, but there's a lot of Hispanics and a lot of blacks. But it's mainly the nature of the people there, which is the real problem. They're just not hardworking people. That's the size of it.
Yeah, unfortunately. Figured your experience there, kind of a microcosm of what's happening in the larger country, sadly.
Yeah, that's precisely why I get so worried about this whole New World Order business, because that's Bridgeport on a global scale.
Exactly. The book is just over about 500 pages, and I just want to read a little bit from the introduction that you wrote. You say here that from ancient times to the present, men have been trying to control others by means of force, both at the individual level and the government level. There have been very few years when the world has been free of any war. Usually there are several wars being waged at the same time. How sad is that? This book focuses on the major events of 1870 onward. During this more recent period, the controllers, of course that's the term you use to identify the people behind the scenes who are pulling the strings, came to realize that domination by brute force did not have lasting favorable results for themselves, so they turned to subtler means. In particular, the name of the game became mind control of the subject group, done in slow, easy stages and in great secrecy. Little by little, the elite came to control the education system, news media, book publishers, foundations and research organizations, as well as the government by their control of money and wealth. Huge international corporations financed by huge international banks and assisted by huge international law firms have an astounding amount of power in world affairs, much of it unknown to the public. The information in this book comes mainly from facts, not theories, found in highly documented books by independent authors. I have read more than 800 such books since I began my research into the New World Order in 1990, when President Bush, that's the first one, the H.W. Bush, talked about it. Also used more than 400 recordings, DVDs, CDs, videotapes, and audio tapes. The term to use for this book would be your magnum opus. I mean, this is something that obviously a lot of effort has been put into, and you didn't come by your conclusions by chance, by happenstance, experiencing life for as long as you've had.
Yep, exactly right. When I read all of these books, I evaluate them somewhat along the same lines as our intelligence services do. First of all, I evaluate the author in terms of his or her apparent reliability, and then I also evaluate how the information presented ties in with other known facts, its consistency. Same technique as the CIA uses, and it helps us sort out the good from the bad. One reason I don't use the internet is that anybody can put anything on the internet, and you never know on the surface of it what you see is true or false. Whereas if you have a book by a reputable author with footnotes and bibliography and an index and so forth, that the guy's professional reputation is on the line. You can check out what he said, and you can look up the quotations and everything. That is reliable information. And so that's kind of where I accumulate my things piece by piece, and eventually you get to the point where you can connect the dots and make some sense out of stuff.
What is it about this book that would benefit the reader who went and said, geez, I want to get a copy of this book, this 500-page book?
Well, there's two different types of people that be interested in this. First would be those that have little or no background information about this whole group of influential people pulling strings behind the scenes. So it could be a total introduction, which would be potentially an eye-opener for the average person. But also, it's highly documented, highly cross-referenced with a large bibliography, and everything's in chronological order. So it also would be a good reference tool for people that are already quite knowledgeable about the New World Order and all the various ramifications of it.
Mm-hmm. Why did you start in 1870?
Because that was when the British elite got together and formed their Society of the Elect, and their plan was that eventually the British would rule the entire world because of their thing. I call it the Oxford elite, because they were all at Oxford University, and with Ruskin and Rhodes and all the rest of that crowd, they would hopefully literally come to rule the world in time. And, of course, even then they pretty much ruled a good part of the world because the British Navy was very powerful. That was one of the main streams of the controllers, as it were. That eventually led to the roundtable groups, which in turn led to the institutes of international affairs like the Royal Institute in London and the United States counterpart, which is the Council on Foreign Relations, and others similar to it around the world. And that's one of the key driving forces amongst the controllers, along with other groups such as the Bilderberg Group and the Trilateral Commission, all of which I explain in some detail in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess we could then really list 1870 as the beginning of the modern era.
Yes, I would say. For our purposes, it is, certainly.
Mm-hmm. And I guess for the purposes of anybody who wants to understand the world we live in today and how it functions, I mean, I'm looking out of my window right now, and, it's a pretty day here in Florida Panhandle, not much going on out there, but that is the deception here, because behind the scenes, behind that house that I'm looking at right there across the street, there's a mortgage. And tied to that mortgage are banks and other companies and individuals. And it gets pretty ugly, I guess, as you go beyond the beauty of this country. I mean, most of the country is just downright beautiful. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes, indeed. And indeed, most of the people are very nice people. There's only a very small handful at the top, some of whom are outright psychopaths, and they not only are power hungry and money hungry, but they don't care even if they kill people. It's a different breed of people altogether. And that's what I was kind of like emphasizing. And of course, they try to do the best they can to keep their activities hidden from the general public. And they've managed to pretty much control the major news media. So what we learn from the television, for example, or newspapers or whatnot is limited to what they want us to know. The rest of it they do their best to hide. And it's only by reading well-researched books like I've been into that you really find out what's really happening.
Mm-hmm. You hear a lot from people who claim that the Jews control everything. They control the media, they control the financial system, the educational system, the legal system. Is it just the Jews, or is it a bigger entity that's controlling everything?
It's much bigger. Personally, I have a lot of Jewish friends and neighbors. I think very highly of them. They contribute a lot. But in terms of this global elite, there's a small number of Jews that are involved. There's a small number of Christians involved, a small number of Muslims involved, what they might call the top 1%. And they, unfortunately, have very evil ways. So regardless of what particular religious faith, if any, they claim, I would say the real God is money. But be that as it may, it's an unfortunate situation, the extent of the control that they have. And since they have managed to literally control most of the major governments of the world, they have been able to literally get away with murder.
So it's not that there's a preponderance of Jews, let's say, in the ranks of the controllers, or are there a preponderance of Jews in the ranks?
Well, you do, get like the Rothschilds, for example, a prominent Jewish family. But on the other hand, there are a lot of Jews who were, for example, opposed to Zionism, especially here in this country. They think what the Israelis are doing over there is terrible, and they don't like it any better than I do. To say that all the problems of the world are Jewish is obviously totally false.
Mm-hmm.
But there are, however, some that are not just good people, let's put it that way.
You have 19 chapters, and the first chapter is the prologue, and the last chapter is a summary and conclusions. And in between, you list a bunch of U.S. presidents.
That's only just for time division. It's not that the presidents themselves were necessarily calling the shots. I just lump it together because in a certain time, for example, Franklin D. Roosevelt was president. During another time, it was Harry Truman and so forth. So I just simply used their administration as a time reference to put the things into chronological order.
Can any of these presidents be viewed as more influential in the plans of the controllers?
I don't think so. I look at them as all basically being puppets under the control of the controllers, rather than being controllers in their own right. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that, they're going to come into office and expect to actually do what they want. I think it's more along the lines of they get elected and then the controllers meet with the new president and they say, congratulations, now we're going to tell you how this is done.
Yep, and that's where these other groups come in, like the Council on Foreign Relations. There's about 4,500 of those people, and they're in influential positions of all sorts, government, business, media, you name it. And between them, their influence on the president himself is massive. And likewise, other groups, even certain secret societies that exist, they literally more than slightly influential. I look at it as they're literally in direct control. They're like the puppet masters that pull the strings. And frankly, I don't think it makes an awful lot of difference which particular individual is president or even which particular political party happens to be in office. It's a consistent group of very wealthy, powerful individuals behind the scenes that really call the shots.
Mm-hmm. And, of course, this is nothing new, and you point this out in your introduction, where you quote a bunch of political leaders who've been pointing out for hundreds and hundreds of years that it's this invisible force behind the scenes that really are controlling it. But President Kennedy, as I'm sure you know, had this now famous, I guess, secret society speech where he talked about these forces. Was Kennedy any different from the other presidents?
Well, yes, his view was that although he was basically raised in sort of much called an elitist society, his dad was quite prominent and all that, he came to realize that the world had become extremely dangerous because of the existence of atomic warfare, and he was literally trying to find ways to have peace in the world. And he was trying to negotiate with Premier Khrushchev, for example, that was directly involved in that Cuban Missile Crisis, try to avoid a nuclear confrontation right then and there. He also was reluctant to get us more involved than we already were in Vietnam and was planning to pull the troops back out that were already there, And in general, he was looking for ways to avoid war and spend more on just basic benefits for the people as a whole. And unfortunately, that didn't sit well with the military-industrial complex. And in my opinion, it was that complex that literally arranged the assassination of Kennedy. This whole bit about blaming it on Lee Harvey Oswald was just a cover-up, a false flag. But, that's the way it's going. So a lot of the future presidents will learn from that example. And if they may personally have a desire for more peace and less war, they tread very carefully on that because they know that this powerful force being right there, literally within their own cabinet.
Right. Which brings us to the latest puppet. Probably, in my opinion, the clearest representation of a puppet is this Barack Hussein Obama. Anything significant about this puppet in reference to the controllers?
Well, I have a lot of difficulty with the current president. On the other hand, I will say that I do admire him because every once in a while he's stood up to Prime Minister Netanyahu on the issues. For example, Netanyahu wanted to get us involved with the war in Iran, and Obama says, no, we're going to negotiate instead. I give him credit for that. That's a gutsy move.
Right, but on the other hand, there has never been more financial aid and military aid given to Israel than under his administration.
Israel is a case in point. They get more of our foreign aid than any other nation in the world, even though they're a relatively prosperous nation. personally, I think that would be better advised to cut that back, if not cut it out altogether. But that's just a personal view. I think that Israel is really actually much more of an enemy than a friend to the United States, because they get us involved with all these struggles in the Middle East and elsewhere. And in the long run, I think we'd be better off to have a lot less contact with them than we already do.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people, I think, would agree with you. You mentioned England, obviously, being the progenitor of these controllers. A lot of people think that England is still calling the shots behind the scenes. Would you agree with that, or you think they're pretty much a dead empire?
Well, financially, they, of course, are not what they were in the past, but on the other hand, the City of London, the economics, the whole Bank of England thing, and the Crown, and the whole economic thing is still very powerful, very influential. So I would say that that's equally a powerful center, as it always has been. As you may know, the City of London itself is about a square mile within the heart of London. It is, in effect, an independent sovereign nation with its own rule. So that's where the Bank of England is, and the various other financial things, and so it wields power far beyond what you might suspect given its geographical size. By way of analogy, it's somewhat similar to the District of Columbia in the United States and Vatican City in Rome. It's really an independent sovereign nation unto itself.
Now, after Chapter 19, we go into some appendices, and actually it goes all the way to Q, it looks like, and then the bibliography and index. One of the appendix entries is preparations for martial law in America. What are your views about that, or more in general, based upon what you've seen and studied and researched and thought about all of these decades? Where are we going with this once great experiment and once great nation, Ed?
Well, I think that the Constitution has been virtually totally neglected by these people in power. It's inconvenient because it puts limitations on the federal government, for example, so they just disregard those altogether. They only use the parts that help them, like, for example, you can get to be elected, you're in the House for 2 years and the Senate for 6 years and so forth, and President for 4 years, go along with that part. But anything to do with the Bill of Rights or protecting the American citizens, that's basically ancient history as far as they're concerned. On the other hand, I personally believe that that's still very much valid. I don't believe in the theory that somehow along the line the Constitution was repealed. I think it's still very much an active document, and I would like to see it more vividly enforced in the future. And it still may be, because, look at the way the country is going right now. It's running itself into bankruptcy with all these continuous budget deficits, and the national debt's over $18 trillion already, not counting the unfunded liabilities, like Social Security, which can easily be another $100 trillion. And eventually, people are going to stop loaning money to the government, and it's going to just collapse of its own sheer oversized weight. And that could lead to a really disastrous condition, and that's why I see the buildup of the military forces in our own country, the NORTHCOM and all, and the literal militarization of local police departments and giving them surplus military equipment. And the SWAT raid, there's about 80,000 SWAT raids a year in this country that's getting totally out of sight. The whole rule of law is disappearing and created quite a, shall we say, a lot of discontent. And I just read a book called Battlefield America by Mr. Whitehead. Right. And it was a very upsetting book, to say the least, but unfortunately what he was saying was pretty much true. The government is totally out of control, federal government, and they're totally disregarding the basic concepts and principles that have made our country great, and leading us down to this martial law state, police state, whatever you want to call it, spying on us. It's like they consider us, the American people, the enemy now. It's really quite disturbing. Yeah. So that's part of my motivation, getting these facts out, because in the end, only way we're going to save our country is if people wake up to what's going on.
And I guess one of the best ways to wake up is to read a book like yours.
Well, I would hope so. That's my entire goal on this, is to be informative. On the other hand, I totally oppose any kind of violence. To me, anybody that goes out there and wants to shoot people or wants to bomb people is totally worthless. I don't even know them. What I want to do is get to people's minds, get them thinking, and make them realize what's going on behind the scenes, and educating them on the stuff that the powers that be have been keeping away from them so successfully for so long. That's the whole objective here.
Ed Whitney, the author of The Controllers, Secret Rulers of the World, second edition, expanded and updated. Ed, I want to thank you so much for the time you spent explaining all this to the listeners. And thanks for doing what you're doing and spending all the time and energy that you do on a book such as this. And I'm looking forward to talking to you again real soon.
Well, thank you very much for the call. I really enjoyed talking with you. I hope the discussion adds to people's knowledge of what it is that we're trying to accomplish here, and hopefully get more people thinking about what's really happening in the world and doing something creative to improve things.